A simple act of kindness, a waitress sharing her own meal, would soon change not just a hungry boy's life, but the life of a powerful CEO and the woman herself forever. The waitress moved quickly between the tables, carrying trays and plates with tired arms. She had been on her feet since morning, and her shift was nowhere close to ending. Her shoes pinched her toes, and her back ached, but she forced a polite smile every time she stopped at a table. She had learned long ago that customers notice smiles, not exhaustion. Inside, though, she was worn out. She was working double shifts all week because rent was due, and she could not risk being late. The thought of another bill piling up made her chest tight. She had been working in the restaurant for almost 2 years, and in that time she had seen all types of people. Some treated her kindly, calling her ma'am and thanking her. Others hardly looked at her, snapping their fingers or speaking without lifting their eyes from their phones. She never complained, because she knew she needed the job. She also worked evenings cleaning offices, but the restaurant was where she earned most of her money in tips. Even if some nights the tips were barely enough to cover bus fare home, today had been a particularly slow afternoon. The lunch rush had ended, leaving only a few scattered customers. She leaned against the counter for a moment, sipping from her water glass, when she noticed a small figure sitting alone in one of the corner booths. At first, she thought it was just another customer waiting for someone. But as she looked closer, she realized it was a young boy. He couldn't have been more than 10 or 11 years old. His hair was neatly combed, and his clothes looked expensive, but he sat nervously. Fidgeting with the edge of a napkin, she grabbed her notepad and walked over to him with her usual warm smile. "Hi there, sweetheart," she said softly. "Are you waiting for someone?" The boy looked up at her with wide, unsure eyes. He hesitated before shaking his head. His lips pressed together as if he didn't know what to say. "Do you want something to eat?" she asked kindly. He lowered his gaze and mumbled, I don't have money." The words hit her harder than she expected. She had seen plenty of adults come in and leave without ordering. But there was something heartbreaking about a child sitting alone in a restaurant and admitting he was hungry. She glanced at his small hands, gripping the napkin tightly, and felt a tug in her chest. She crouched down so she could look at him eye to eye. "It's okay," she whispered gently. "You don't need money right now. Just sit tight, okay?" He looked at her with confusion, but he nodded. The waitress stood and walked quickly to the back, where her small lunchbox sat on a shelf. She usually saved her meal for later, but she didn't think twice this time. Inside, she had packed the leftovers from last night's dinner: rice, some vegetables, and a small piece of chicken. It wasn't much, but it was enough to fill an empty stomach. She warmed it in the microwave, placed it on a clean plate, carried it back to the booth. When she set it down in front of him, his eyes widened. "For me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded with a smile. "Yes, for you. Eat up, honey." At first, he hesitated, as though he wasn't sure if it was really okay. Then, when she encouraged him again, he picked up the fork and took a bite. The way he ate told her everything he had truly been hungry. Bite after bite, he ate quickly, almost afraid the food would be taken away. She sat quietly across from him, resting her tired hands on the table, watching him eat. "You like it?" she asked softly. He nodded, his mouth full, and she chuckled. For the first time that day, the heaviness of her shift lifted a little. After a few minutes, the boy slowed down and looked at her. "Thank you," he said with a seriousness that surprised her. "You're really kind." She patted his hand gently. "You don't need to thank me. Everyone deserves a meal." He hesitated, then added, "My dad. He's always busy. He doesn't have time to eat with me." His words came out almost like a confession, and his eyes dropped again. The waitress's heart softened even more. She had grown up without much. She knew what it was like to feel invisible sometimes. She wanted to ask who his father was, but she decided not to push. Instead, she smiled warmly and said, "I'm sure your dad cares about you. Maybe he's just busy with work, but you should always remember you're important." 2. The boy looked at her carefully, as if weighing her words, then gave a small smile. "You sound like my teacher," he said. And she laughed quietly, They sat together for a little longer while he finished eating. For her, it was just a simple act sharing food. But for him, it seemed like something bigger. His shoulders relaxed, and the nervous way he had been fidgeting disappeared. He looked more at ease, as though the kindness of a stranger had made him feel safe, as she cleared the empty plate. He looked at her again. "Do you eat this every day?" he asked innocently. She chuckled and nodded. "Pretty much. Leftovers are my specialty." She tried to keep her tone light, but inside, she wondered what he thought of her simple meal compared to what he was probably used to. Before he could ask more, another table called for her, and she excused herself. But as she walked away, she glanced back. The boy was still watching her with grateful eyes, and she couldn't help but smile. She had no idea that this small moment, her sharing her own food, would be noticed by someone important. Someone who would change her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. That afternoon stayed quiet. But inside her heart, there was a little warmth that hadn't been there earlier. She thought about the boy often as she carried on with her shift, wondering why he had been alone and wishing he had someone who noticed him more. She didn't know who he was, but she knew one thing for sure. Sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness mattered more than anything else. The boy sat quietly in the booth, his small fingers tracing patterns on the wooden table after finishing the last bite of the meal she had given him. The waitress returned to check on him, carrying a glass of water. She placed it in front of him gently and asked, "Feeling better now?" He nodded shyly, taking a sip, his eyes lowering as though he wasn't sure if he should speak. She noticed his hesitance and tried to make him comfortable. "You don't need to be afraid," she said with a soft smile. "Sometimes we all need a little help. It's nothing to be ashamed of." The boy looked up, chewing his lip nervously. I didn't know what to do. I was so hungry." His voice cracked slightly, and her heart ached. "You did the right thing by sitting down here," she reassured him. "If you had walked away hungry, that would have been worse. I'm glad you stayed." There was a long pause before he whispered, "You gave me your own food, didn't you?" She blinked in surprise. He was sharper than she thought. Smiling, she nodded. "Yes, I did. But don't worry about it. I'll be fine." His brows furrowed. "But won't you be hungry later?" The question caught her off guard. No one ever asked her that. People ordered meals, complained about fries not being crispy enough, and left without a second glance at her. But here was this boy, worried about her. She swallowed a lump in her throat and shook her head. "I'll manage. Sometimes, making sure someone else eats is more important." The boy seemed to think about her words. His small shoulders relaxed a little, and for the first time, a genuine smile spread across his face. "You're nice," he said softly. "You remind me of my mom's friend. She always made sure I ate too." The waitress chuckled lightly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Well, then I'll take that as a compliment." For the next few minutes, she sat with him, asking gentle questions without prying too much. She learned that his name was Daniel. He was 10 years old, and though he didn't mention much about his mother, he spoke about his father with a strange mix of pride and sadness. "My dad is really important," Daniel said, his eyes brightening for a second. "He has a big office, and a lot of people listen to him." But his voice trailed off, and the light in his eyes dimmed. "He doesn't have time to eat with me. He always says he's busy." The waitress felt her heart tighten. She knew what it was like to grow up missing something. She had worked since she was a teenager because her own parents couldn't afford much. She had never wanted pity, only understanding. Looking at the boy, she saw that same need, the longing to be noticed. She reached across the table and tapped his hand gently. "Your dad must care about you very much. Sometimes when grown-ups are busy, it doesn't mean they don't love you. It just means they're caught up in things they think are important. But I don't want important things."
"Oh."
Daniel blurted out suddenly. "I just want him to eat with me, or talk to me." His small voice carried so much honesty that it left the waitress speechless for a moment. She wanted to say something comforting but didn't want to make promises she couldn't keep. Instead, she said softly, "Maybe he needs someone to remind him. Sometimes, dads need that too." Daniel tilted his head, studying her face. "Do you have kids?" The question made her laugh quietly, though there was sadness behind it. "No, not yet," she answered. "But I have a little brother I used to take care of. I had to make sure he ate, did his homework, and stayed out of trouble. So I guess in a way I know what it's like to look after someone younger." Daniel nodded thoughtfully, as if he understood. Then, with a small grin, he said, "You'd be a good mom someday." The words touched her more than she expected. She smiled warmly, though she didn't say anything back, as their conversation continued. She noticed the boy beginning to relax. The nervousness that had been written all over his face earlier started to fade. His shoulders weren't so tight. He even laughed at one of her jokes about how customers sometimes argued over the size of pancakes. The restaurant around them stayed quiet. A couple of older men read newspapers at the counter, and one woman sipped coffee near the window. Nobody paid much attention to the boy in the corner booth. To the waitress, it felt like a little bubble of peace in her otherwise chaotic day. At one point, she stood to refill his water. When she came back, she noticed he had pushed the plate closer to the edge of the table. "You didn't eat everything," she teased. Daniel grinned sheepishly. "I left a little for you." She froze for a second, caught off guard. She had given him her only meal, and here he was, offering a part of it back. She felt her eyes sting with unexpected tears, but she quickly blinked them away. "That's sweet," she said softly, "but it's yours. I wanted you to have it." He pushed the plate back, toward himself reluctantly, then picked up the fork again. "Okay, but next time, we'll share." Something about the way he said "next time" made her smile. He already trusted her enough to think of a next time. It warmed her heart in a way she hadn't felt in years. After he finished the last bite, sat back looking much calmer than before. The shadows of hunger and worry that had clouded his face earlier were gone, replaced by the relaxed look of a boy who finally felt safe. The waitress leaned her elbows on the table for a moment. "You know," she said gently, "life is full of busy people, but kindness is what makes it easier. And you, Daniel, you should always remember that someone cares about you, even if it's just a waitress who lent you her leftovers." Daniel giggled softly at her words, but there was a seriousness in his eyes too. "I'll remember," he promised. She had no idea at that moment how important that promise would become. For now, she was simply glad to see a boy's empty stomach filled and his worried little heart eased, even just for a while. She stood to return to her work, but not before giving him one last smile. As she walked back to the counter, Daniel watched her, the image of her kindness burning quietly into his memory. And though she didn't know it yet, that same kindness would soon be witnessed by someone else, someone whose opinion could change the entire direction of her life. The restaurant door opened with a sharp chime as the tall figure of a man in a dark suit stepped inside. His polished shoes clicked against the tiled floor, and the air in the small place seemed to shift for a moment. The waitresses behind the counter straightened unconsciously, and even the manager peeked from the kitchen door. Everyone knew him by sight. He was the CEO who sometimes came in with business partners for quick meetings. He never lingered, never smiled, always carried an air of importance that made people nervous. Today, however, he wasn't surrounded by assistants or clients. He walked in alone, scanning the room quickly, his sharp eyes moving with precision. When his gaze fell on the corner booth, his steps slowed. There sat his son Daniel, eating from a plate that clearly wasn't from the restaurant menu. The boy looked happier than usual. The sight made the man's brow furrow. He approached quietly, his expensive watch catching the light as he rested a hand on the edge of the table. "Daniel," he said firmly. The boy jumped slightly and turned to look at him. Relief spread across his face, but also a hint of fear, as though he had been caught doing something wrong. "Dad," Daniel said softly. The CEO's eyes narrowed on the plate in front of him. It wasn't restaurant food, it looked like a homemade meal. His gaze flickered upward, and there stood the waitress, holding an empty tray and watching with wide eyes. He recognized her vaguely as the one who always served him during his previous visits, the one who smiled even when her eyes looked tired. "What's going on here?" His tone was controlled, but cold. The waitress froze for a second, then stepped forward, her voice steady but gentle. "Your son was hungry, sir. I gave him some of my food." The CEO's eyes darkened, suspicion flashing through them. He had built his career on mistrust, on questioning motives, on never assuming kindness was free. For a moment, he wondered if this woman had done it for attention, for pity, or even for money. His jaw tightened as he looked back at his son. "Is that true, Daniel?" The boy nodded quickly. "Yes, Dad. I was really hungry, and she helped me. She didn't ask for anything. She just gave me her food." His voice carried a hint of pride, as if defending her against his father's doubt. The CEO stood silently, his mind racing. He wasn't used to strangers doing anything for his child, much less giving away their own meal. He studied the waitress, noting her simple uniform, the faint tiredness on her face, the way her shoes looked worn from long hours. Nothing about her suggested hidden motives. She looked like someone who had little to give, yet had chosen to share it anyway. Still, he asked, sharply, "Why?" The question hung in the air. The waitress clasped her hands together nervously but answered honestly. "Because he was hungry? Because he's a child." I couldn't ignore that. For the first time in a long while, the CEO felt something stir inside him. Her answer was simple, almost too simple, and yet it unsettled him. He turned to Daniel, who looked back at him with pleading eyes. "She was nice to me, Dad," the boy said. "Really nice." I didn't feel scared anymore. Those words pierced him. He realized with a pang of guilt that his son had felt safer with a stranger than with his own father. He sat down slowly across from Daniel, loosening his tie slightly. The boy looked at him curiously, as though unsure how to react. The waitress stood nearby, ready to retreat, but the CEO motioned for her to stay. "Sit," he said firmly, though his voice was softer now. She hesitated before sliding into the booth beside Daniel. He studied her carefully, his sharp gaze trying to read every detail. "You gave away your own meal?" he asked again, this time not with suspicion but genuine curiosity. She nodded. "Yes, I usually save my leftovers for later, but..." He looked like he needed it more than I did. The CEO leaned back, silent for a long moment. He had spent years in boardrooms, surrounded by people who only acted kind if there was something to gain. He couldn't remember the last time he'd seen someone give without expecting anything in return. Daniel spoke again, his voice stronger now. "Dad, she told me I should remind you that I'm important too." The boy's honesty caught both adults by surprise. The waitress's cheeks turned red, but she didn't deny it. The CEO's chest tightened. He glanced at his son, who looked at him with so much hope it was almost painful. For the first time, he noticed how thin Daniel's arms were, how tired his eyes looked. When had he last truly sat with his son? When had he last eaten a meal together without checking his phone or rushing out for a meeting? He couldn't remember. The waitress broke the silence gently. "He's a good boy. You should be proud." Her words, spoken with quiet sincerity, made something shift in him. He had heard endless flattery in his life, but nothing ever felt real. These simple words from a waitress cut deeper than all the praise he had received in corporate offices. For a moment, the CEO felt exposed. He wasn't used to being seen not as a powerful figure, but as a father who was failing. He cleared his throat and stood up abruptly, straightening his jacket. "Thank you," he said stiffly, the words strange on his tongue. The waitress nodded politely, though she could see the weight in his expression. Daniel slid out of the booth and stood beside his father. But before leaving, he turned to her and whispered, "I'll remember what you said." The CEO placed a hand on his son's shoulder, guiding him toward the door. Yet as he walked out of the restaurant, he glanced back once, his eyes meeting hers. For a fleeting second, there was no coldness in them, only something unreadable, almost vulnerable. Outside, the city buzzed with life. Cars honked, people hurried by, and the CEO stood still with his son beside him. His thoughts were far from his company, his meetings, or his endless deadlines. Instead, his mind replayed the image of a tired waitress giving her only meal to a child who wasn't even... All the wealth, the success, the power, what did it mean if his own son had to rely on a stranger for comfort? That single moment inside the restaurant unsettled him more than any business failure ever had. And though he walked away, trying to push the feelings aside, deep inside he knew this encounter was not something he could ignore. The waitress's simple kindness had left a mark, one that would continue to grow until it forced him to face truths he had long avoided. The following days at the restaurant felt normal on the surface, but the waitress noticed something different. The man in the dark suit, the one who carried himself like he owned the world, began to appear more often. At first, she thought it was coincidence, but then she realized it wasn't. He wasn't always with business partners anymore. Sometimes he came in with Daniel, and other times he came alone, sitting quietly in a corner where he could observe without being noticed. Whenever he arrived, the air shifted in the room. Other waitresses whispered. The manager stood a little straighter, and even the customers seemed to lower their voices. He had that kind of presence. But the waitress tried to treat him just like anyone else. She greeted him with the same smile she gave every customer, though her heart beat faster when his sharp eyes followed her across the room. What she didn't know was that the CEO was watching her more closely now. He remembered that day clearly, the sight of his son eating from her small plate of leftovers. And it wouldn't leave his mind. He was used to people being polite to him because of his power. He was used to fake compliments and forced laughter in his meetings. But this woman had done something different. She hadn't looked at him when she gave. She hadn't asked for anything. She had simply noticed a hungry child and acted. One afternoon, he came in earlier than usual. Daniel was with him this time. The boy looked brighter, happier than before. The waitress noticed it immediately as she walked over with menus. Daniel grinned at her like he was meeting an old friend. "Hi," he said cheerfully. "Remember me?" The waitress laughed softly. "Of course, I remember you. How are you, Daniel?" "I'm good," he said quickly. "Dad brought me this time." He looked up at his father with obvious pride, as if to prove he wasn't alone anymore. The CEO cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. His expression was serious, but there was a gentleness in the way he glanced at his son. The waitress caught it, though he didn't notice. She took their orders, but when she walked away, she felt something stir inside her. She couldn't explain it, but it felt like the beginning of something different. Over the next week, the visits continued. Sometimes Daniel would wave at her excitedly when he entered. Other times the CEO would come in and simply sit in silence, his eyes following her movements. He never said much, but she could sense he was studying her. One evening, she overheard two waitresses whispering in the back. "Why does he keep coming here?" one asked. "He could eat anywhere. Fancy hotels, private clubs. But he's here almost every day now." "Maybe it's because of his son," the other replied. "Or maybe it's because of her." Their eyes flicked toward the waitress before they both giggled. Softly, the waitress brushed it off, but deep inside she wondered too. Why was he coming back again and again? One night, the restaurant was almost empty. The CEO sat with Daniel in their usual booth and she brought them their food. As she set the plates down, she overheard a bit of their conversation. Daniel was talking about school, about how he wanted his dad to see his science project. The boy's voice was excited, but then he added quietly, "You'll come this time, right?" The CEO hesitated. For a moment, the waitress thought he might brush it off, but then he leaned forward and said firmly, "Yes, I'll be there." Daniel's face lit up. It was such a simple promise, but it meant the world to him. The waitress turned away quickly before they noticed the emotion in her eyes. Later that night, as she cleared their plates, the CEO spoke to her directly for the first time in days. "You care about my son," he said simply, his tone unreadable. She paused, then nodded. "Yes, he's a good boy. He just needed someone to notice." The CEO studied her silently, his expression tight. She could tell he was thinking about something deeper, but he didn't say more. He left a generous tip on the table before walking out with Daniel. That moment stayed with him. He began to realize how much he had missed in his own son's life. Board meetings, late nights at the office, endless phone calls. He had told himself it was all for Daniel's future. But what kind of future was he building if his son felt alone? The waitress, without knowing it, became a mirror he couldn't look away from. Her kindness to Daniel made him question his own choices. He found himself remembering things he had long buried, the way he used to play with Daniel when he was small. The laughter they once shared before work consumed everything. One day, he stayed longer at the restaurant after Daniel went to the restroom. The waitress passed by and he stopped her. "How do you do it?" he asked suddenly. She frowned slightly. Do what? Work so hard, smile at everyone, and still have the heart to give away your own food, he said quietly. His voice lower than usual. She looked down at her tray, unsure how to answer. Finally, she said, life is hard for everyone in different ways. But being kind doesn't cost anything. It just makes the weight easier to carry. Her words struck him harder than he expected. He had spent years calculating the cost of everything, every deal, every move. Yet here was someone who valued something that couldn't be measured: kindness. That night, after leaving the restaurant, he sat in his car longer than usual. Daniel had fallen asleep in the back seat, his small head resting against the window. The CEO watched him, realizing just how much of his childhood he had already missed. The guilt weighed heavy on his chest. But beneath it was something else: resolve. He thought about the waitress's tired smile, the way she worked without complaint, the way she spoke to Daniel as if he were the most important boy in the world. And he knew he couldn't ignore what he had seen. The turning point had come quietly, not with a grand event, but with small moments that added up until they became impossible to ignore. The CEO, a man who had built walls around himself for years, felt them beginning to crack because of one simple act of kindness. He decided then that he needed to change, not just for his son, but for himself, and he knew the waitress had something to do with it. Days passed after the CEO's quiet realization, but the waitress went about her life as usual, unaware of how deeply she had affected him. She worked her shifts with the same determination, carrying trays, refilling drinks, and offering gentle smiles to customers who often barely noticed her. She had no idea that the CEO's visits were now part of a much larger thought process, one that would soon change her life completely. One afternoon, he entered the restaurant alone. She was serving a table near the window, wiping down surfaces, and didn't notice him immediately. When she finally saw him, she felt a familiar tension. The kind that came with knowing someone of great authority was present, but this time it was different. His expression was serious, yes, but there was no judgment. There was something else, something she couldn't quite identify. He motioned for her to come over, and her heart skipped a beat. She walked toward him carefully, trying to appear confident, though a flutter of curiosity and nervousness ran through her. He gestured for her to sit across from him at an empty table. She hesitated, then slid into the chair, careful to keep her hands folded on the tabletop. "I've been thinking about you," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "About what you did for my son that day. About how you treat him, how you treat everyone. I need to understand something. How do you keep doing this? How do you keep being kind when life is so hard?" The waitress paused, unsure how to answer. She looked down at her hands and then back at him. "I don't know," she said honestly. I guess I just can't help it. I know what it's like to be hungry, to feel unnoticed. And if I can make someone feel safe or cared for, even for a moment, it feels right." He nodded slowly, absorbing her words. There was a long pause as he looked at her, something unspoken passing between them. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. "I want to help you," he said simply. She blinked in surprise. "Help me?" "Yes," he replied. "I see how hard you work. I see how much you give, even when you have so little. I want to give you something in return, not just for what you did for my son, but because I believe you deserve more than this." The waitress's mind raced. Offers from people like him often came with conditions, strings attached, but the sincerity in his eyes made her pause. I don't know what to say," she admitted. "Say yes," he said with a small smile. "I want to offer you a position in my company. Something that gives you stability, security, and the chance to grow. I know you've been working tirelessly. I want to make sure you don't have to struggle like this anymore." She stared at him, disbelief written all over her face. Her life had always been about surviving, about making sure there was enough food on the table, enough rent paid, enough money to keep moving forward. She had never imagined a future like this one, where someone noticed her, truly noticed her, and valued her for who she was. "Why me?" she asked quietly. "Because you showed me something I've been missing," he said. "Kindness, attention, care. I've spent years thinking power and money were the most important things. But watching you with Daniel, reminded me of what really matters. I want you to have a life that reflects your heart, not just your hard work." Tears threatened to spill over, but she blinked them back. "I don't know what to say. I never expected anything like this." "You don't need to say anything yet," he replied. "Just think about it. I want to meet with you privately, outside the restaurant, to discuss details." "You've earned this opportunity simply by being yourself." The waitress nodded, still stunned, but there was a spark of hope in her chest she hadn't felt in years. She went about the rest of her shift, her mind racing with possibilities. She thought about her family, about the bills that had been piling up, about the sleepless nights and endless worries. Maybe now things could change. Maybe now she could finally breathe. That evening, after her shift ended, she returned home. Her movements slower than usual as she tried to process everything. Daniel's words from before echoed in her mind. "You'd be a good mom someday." She smiled softly, thinking about how far she had come, how small acts of care had unexpectedly brought her to this moment. A few days later, she met the CEO in a quiet office downtown. The room was sleek and professional, a stark contrast to the simple restaurant where their paths had first crossed. She felt nervous at first, unsure how to behave in a setting so different from her usual life. But the CEO's calm demeanor put her at ease. He explained the position he had in mind for her, a role in employee relations, helping employees feel valued and supported. It was perfect for someone with her compassion, her experience with people, and her natural ability to connect with others. He outlined the salary, benefits, and opportunities for growth, all of which made her dizzy with disbelief. As she listened, she realized this was more than just a job offer. It was a chance to step into a new life, one where her hard work and kindness could truly be recognized and rewarded. She remembered her past struggles, the nights she had gone without proper meals, the worry about making rent, the exhaustion from juggling multiple jobs, and felt a deep sense of gratitude for this unexpected opportunity. I accept," she said finally, her voice trembling with emotion. The CEO nodded, a small smile on his face. "I'm glad. You deserve this." Leaving the office that day, she felt lighter than she had in years. The world seemed brighter, possibilities endless. She thought about Daniel and how a simple act of feeding him had led to this incredible turn in her life. It was almost surreal, how one small choice, one act of kindness, could ripple outward and change everything. In the following weeks, she transitioned into her new role. The work was different, but fulfilling in ways she hadn't imagined. She met employees from all parts of the company, helping them feel seen, supported, and appreciated. Her natural empathy and warmth made her exceptional at her job. And soon she became valued not just by the CEO, but by the entire organization. Meanwhile, the CEO began to change as well. He spent more time with Daniel, attending school events and sharing meals, often with the waitress nearby. He realized that wealth and power were meaningless without family and human connection. The small act of kindness from the waitress had opened his eyes. Reshaping his priorities and helping him reconnect with his son, Daniel thrived in the attention and care he received. No longer feeling overlooked or alone, he continued to look up to the waitress, sometimes sharing little victories with her. Always remembering the day she had fed him when he was hungry. For the waitress, life was no longer just about survival. It was about opportunities, growth, and seeing the direct impact of her kindness. The simple choice to feed a hungry child had not only helped Daniel, but it also reshaped the lives of his father and herself in ways she could never have imagined. And though she still remembered her struggles, she carried a new sense of hope, a reminder that even the smallest act of care could change the course of life forever.